Lori Barr, I am so happy that you are here with me to talk about what I think on the surface could feel like a heavy and difficult topic, but it's one that I think is really important that all of us as leaders really think about, which is dealing with crisis, especially in the workplace. Obviously, we're in the midst of and hopefully on the tail end of this pandemic. So it's one of those things that I think is kind of fresh, at least in my mind, and perhaps on many team members and leaders and managers. You know, we've seen our teams experience crisis. We've seen individuals on our team deal with unexpected or individual acute crises. And perhaps we've experienced some individual and team crises ourselves. So it's something that is sort of, I think, top of mind for me, and really knowing how we as leaders, as well as how we as humans, can effectively work with, those that we love and in the workplace, dealing with crisis. And so there's really no one better I can think of to have this conversation with than you. So you're the owner founder of Empathic Communications. You work with both individuals and corporations on emotional wellness and having difficult conversations. So I'm grateful that you're here with me today to talk about crisis, because it's something that I think that often we're a little nervous or maybe leery to really open up and talk about, but it's so important that we do. Is that right?
I completely agree with you, Kate. And first, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me here with you to have this conversation. I completely agree that it's incredibly important that we do talk about this. I think, if anything, in my opinion, positive that has come out of this pandemic is that it is really opening up this conversation to talk more openly about supporting people through crisis, regardless of what that crisis might be. So really happy to be here with you and have that conversation.
Oh, well, thank you. You know, there are probably going to be elements of this conversation that I have personal experience with and connections. And I think that our listeners will as well, perhaps. It's whether they personally have been through it or someone on their team. The types of crises I think of are, death and illness, divorce, even behavior issues with children, health issues with children. I think that there's different kinds of crises that people can experience. I kind of think of two different buckets, one being like acute, unexpected, surprising. They came to work on Monday and everything was fine, and then all of a sudden on Tuesday, whether you hear about it or whether you get a phone call or they just show up and something has dramatically changed in somebody's life or in your own life. And then there's the other ones that could be weeks, could be years of something building and the outcome and the timeline being unknown. In both cases, talk to me about what the impact of those types of crises and that heaviness and shock, how that affects us when we show up to work.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that question, Kate. I mean, it's, the first thing I want to say is that, we are human first, right? Always.
Yeah.
So if we hear still, I believe we hear that comment around, kind of you leave your personal life at home, but we can't really do that because we are human. We're bringing our whole selves into the workplace. Yeah. So we really have to be conscious of that as leaders, as coworkers. Mm-hmm. So, regardless of whether it is an acute situation or a more chronic situation, as humans, we're all going to react differently. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I would say around this is to really understand that that's the case, that everyone has different reactions, everyone has different needs. And so, never to make assumptions about what someone needs and to really approach that person from a place of empathy and compassion first.
So I hear a lot about this empathy. Mm-hmm. And I think that some of us think that we're being empathetic when we say things, I'm so sorry to hear about that. Or maybe even have, like, how do you define empathy? And how does empathy look and feel to you, especially in a professional environment?
Sure. Empathy is something I talk about all the time in all the work that I do. And it is something I think that people are understanding it more and more now. It's becoming a more mainstream concept that we talk about.
Yeah.
But it is, it's really about making someone feel heard and understood, right? And so you can imagine how important that is when you're in crisis, right? So, and to what I started doing with empathy is really breaking it down for people into the three different types of empathy,
Okay.
to just kind of help have a greater understanding of it.
Mhm.
The first is cognitive empathy. So that's that place of really trying to take someone else's perspective, right? Kind of that more logical thinking brain.
Sure.
So if you are able to empathize with someone at a cognitive level, you're really able to say, okay, I understand where you're coming from. I can see your perspective, but you're not really going into the emotional aspect as much.
Okay.
The second is emotional empathy.
Okay.
So emotional empathy is where that sense of, you're really feeling with someone, right? So it is that sense of, if someone's very upset, you can really go there and feel that with them.
Yeah.
And I think that's oftentimes what people really think about empathy,
Definitely.
but that's not the only kind of empathy, right? So that's one piece of it. And the third is called compassionate empathy, or as we call it in counseling, empathic concern.
Okay.
So that's kind of a balance of those pieces, right? Because with cognitive empathy, again, really helpful in a lot of certain circumstances and always important to be able to take someone else's perspective.
Mhm.
But at times it may seem a little bit too detached, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And then emotional empathy, again, very important. That helps you connect with someone very quickly. However, it can really tip the scale, right? If you're being pulled too much in that emotional empathic way, you can actually stop being supportive to someone because you're so in their emotions that the balance is off, and so you stop actually being a support. If you are being able to practice compassionate empathy, it really is kind of that balance where you can see that perspective, in that logical brain, and then you can tap into those emotions. And then the third piece of it is actually being able to be motivated to kind of help in some capacity.
Okay.
Yeah.
So especially in a workplace environment, I can see where it could become problematic to be too compassionately or emotionally empathetic, because then it could kind of derail the focus from the purpose of us being here at work. Are there any kind of best practices? I think especially if we're kind of in that category of this is a crisis happening to somebody else,
Mhm.
like what that helping can and should look like especially in a professional environment.
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, you would want to try to stay in that space of the compassionate empathy, right? So I kind of think of it as a dial, so
Yeah.
you feel yourself going too far down the emotional path, right? What's going to help bring you back to that?
Mhm.
And that really comes to self-awareness, right? And really knowing ourselves. And sometimes we can be surprised, right? If someone's telling us a story about what they're experiencing, and that we can either really relate to that, maybe we've experienced that ourselves, or something else is going on in our life, we can go there very quickly.
Mhm.
So, part of it is really slowing down, kind of tuning into ourselves and knowing, okay, I'm kind of starting to fall down that path. Let me pick myself back up. And, certain ways of being able to do that are really practicing good listening with
Okay.
someone,
Mhm.
helping, and that can help you stay present with them. And I don't know if you've heard of the term reflective listening, but really just hearing what someone's saying and be able to reflect back what you're hearing. That
Mhm.
can really help you stay with them in that conversation, in the present moment, and for you not to be kind of pulled down into your own emotional experience.
Yeah, I mean, from a personal standpoint, I could see where not only that could be easy for me to do, but has happened for sure.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm an empath by nature, as I know some people are as well. And so I can see where as opposed to pulling down and getting pulled into your own history, memory, experiences, and or your deep empathy and want to be down in that hole with them. By reflecting, listening helps ensure that you're hearing them and you're getting the story accurately and that you're still connected and paying attention. I think that's really helpful advice.
Yeah,
Um,
so it can absolutely help the situation. Yeah.
yeah. Well, so now it got me thinking about, as we said, there's sort of, from a leadership standpoint, if someone, on an individual level is having a crisis, maybe your team is having a crisis. And then also when we ourselves are having crisis, I think those are kind of three helpful buckets that you kind of laid out. Talk to me about how each of those kind of buckets show up and how we as leaders and as a team can navigate those three different kind of categories of crisis at work.
Sure. So, should we, maybe I'll start with if you are personally experiencing a crisis, right? So if you have had something happen again, regardless of if it's chronic or acute or, whatever the situation might be, if you're really, if you're struggling, how do you go into the workplace and help have a productive experience, right? And part of that is really around, again, that self-awareness piece, knowing yourself and tuning into what your needs are, which can be really difficult when you're experiencing a crisis. So really slowing down and trying to determine first, what is it that you need? And then being able to communicate that with your supervisor, having a conversation around what your needs might be. And then, whether that needs to go to HR, whatever your organization looks like. But really having that open conversation and knowing yourself. So that way, by taking care of yourself in that way, it will lead to being able to be more productive and effective at work. And sometimes that might mean taking a break. Maybe I will need to have a break right now. But again, it speaks to everyone being different. Some people may want to carry on working because that's what makes them feel better, right?
Sure.
So really knowing yourself and being able to have that communication with your organization is important.
What if I'm a verbose person who has finding words is rarely difficult for me, but my husband would fall into the latter category. I think putting words in that. So I know you mentioned a dial and a spectrum. What if finding those types of words, and especially identifying your needs, is difficult, or being vulnerable? I mean, we're talking about crisis, we're talking about pain, we're talking about anxiety, we're talking about fear.
Yeah.
You know, some of us may work in environments where being vulnerable and sharing our emotions and feelings is a norm, but sometimes it's not. And so depending on, while there's spectrums in workplace cultures and as individuals, are there any sort of, thoughts around how you can put words around your needs or even identifying your needs and communicating them in what is already a difficult time?
Sure. And, again, that's completely personal. Some people are going to want to share more than others, but it is really important that you determine within yourself what you're comfortable sharing, right?
Sure.
Because you can express, I've had a personal situation happen and I'm going to need to have a couple of days off and have that conversation very generally. Or some people may give a little bit more detail, but it's really up to that person to decide what they're comfortable sharing.
I think that's a good point. And like identifying, like taking a beat to identify like how much of this situation am I really comfortable, and like being comfortable putting boundaries around what you're comfortable with sharing, because once you've shared, sort of you can't unshare it. But then again, if someone's a big sharer, like myself, for example, I could see where it could feel inauthentic. So I guess just doing that reflective listening. What I'm hearing you say is check in with yourself and figure out what really is going to help meet your needs. So if sharing a lot and getting about the situation serves you and you're comfortable with that, great, do it. But don't feel obligated to if it makes you uncomfortable, that you can set boundaries around how much of your personal situation you share.
Yeah. And I mean, boundaries are important, right? So, another caveat to that is what I would say is, really take your time as much as you can, because
Mhm.
oftentimes if we react rather than respond,
Mm.
you may say something that you wish you wouldn't have, right? So, really just trying to take that time, the moment, even just pausing and tuning into what you're feeling and what you really do want to share is important. Because again, once it's out there, you can't take it back. So just again, knowing yourself, knowing how that feels, and maybe doing that in baby steps as well. You can say something very broad at the beginning and sit with that. And then, or as a situation unfolds, right, you can share a little bit more. But one big tip is to really just kind of take your time with that as much as you can.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned about I need a few days. Or, I have a personal nutrition, I'm gonna need a few days. And then others
Mhm.
might be like, hey, I'm gonna come back in and, get back to work right away. Um, and I think sometimes I've seen either experience myself or through others, seeing where there's again, everything being on a pendulum and on a scale, but something like I need all this time off and I need to just kind of shut down and feel my feelings, which
Mhm.
is valid. But then perhaps kind of a push to get back to some normalcy might be effective.
Mhm.
Um, on the other extreme, I'm going to get right back at it. Nope, everything's fine. Oh, I know my husband just died, but everything's fine. I promise. I'm better off being back at the board meeting, and I'll lead it next week. It's like, oh, hold on. But that could that I mean those extremes are valid to some extent, and perhaps this is a good transition to that other kind of category of it not being, maybe touching on it being ourselves, but even thinking about how we can shepherd and look out for those in our teams who perhaps figuring out navigating what's best for people, not just in terms of time off, but in the getting back to normalcy and how we can navigate those timelines for grief or for struggle, for anxiety and things like that.
Sure. Again, it's always personal, it's always individual differences. But what I would say around that is, as a leader, really in any type of crisis, it's communicating clearly and consistently, right? And honestly, right? So the communication piece is huge. So, you are going to be wanting to check in with that person. So, in really tuning into how they're doing, what they need, right? And that again will evolve as time goes by, as the situation potentially evolves. But really having that open communication and those check-ins with someone, and again, leaving it on their terms, as far as you're not going to be hounding them to tell you things that they're not comfortable telling you, but really just keeping that communication door open. And then another
Mhm.
piece of this is what resources are available from the organization. Many organizations have EAP programs, which it can be great resources for people. So as a leader, you can really make sure that you're letting the person know, hey, we have these resources available, whether it's you talking through that with them or an HR person. And certainly the more, if you have someone to refer them to in HR specifically, that can be very helpful. But so really that communication, check in, and knowing what resources are available for them.
Yeah. I think about Rise, for example, and then even a lot of our members are small businesses who
Mhm.
maybe it's just them and a business partner,
Yeah.
or maybe it's just themselves, solopreneurs, or having a small business where having an HR, there is no HR department.
Yeah.
And you think about, oh my gosh, how can I be there for my people? Like,
Mhm.
I've certainly referred, my own personal therapist to, friends and members and team members and things like that before. Are there any other kind of things, if you think about uh, in a smaller organization, and either things that you can do as an individual, if you don't have that really, that professional resource of an HR expert?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many resources out there, whether it's through different website resources, yeah, through personal connections, but really that first piece is checking in with the person, depending on whatever the situation is, and seeing, hey, you know, would it be helpful for me to get some resources for you around this? And, you know, then you can reach out to experts in the field, or you can, you know, get on the website. You know, certainly I have been a resource finder for organizations before, for these types of situations. Someone who knows kind of, okay, this is a great website for grief and loss, or this is a great website for, you know, some good COVID information that's relevant for this situation. So really, I think the more you can provide resource and support, I mean, you're not going to be their therapist, you know, that's not your job, but being able to provide referral and resource can be really helpful to someone. And, you know, if they choose to use that, great. If not, great. It's completely up to them. But by being able to provide that, it is a support that you can do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You know, something I keep thinking about is earlier, you know, we were talking about as the individual, you have to really think about boundaries, what boundaries you need to set for yourself around how much you're going to share and how much you're comfortable sharing, and that boundaries are so important. It also makes me think a little bit then too about from the leadership standpoint, you're dealing with someone else with while still having empathy and compassion, which is so important. If we're talking about in a workplace environment too, navigating boundaries and expectations that you still need to honor to continue work moving forward and projects and things like that. And or sometimes you can be as compassionate and empathetic as you want, reach out, try to have open lines of communication, but you can't control the other person's response. How, as a leader, as a business owner or manager, navigating the boundaries that you need for yourself or that your organization needs as well?
Yeah, and I think that it's a great question. It's a really important question because boundaries need to be implemented on all sides, right? So the individual needs to have them, the leader needs to have them, and they need to be clear as well. So, you know, for example, thinking about a leader who has someone who maybe is out on leave for a personal crisis, you know, just setting a time where, okay, I'm going to check in at this time. Is that okay with you? Right? You know, does that work for you? So really trying to implement some kind of consistent check-in, or, you know, a date where we're going to check in and then we'll follow up from there. But being very clear on when that is, instead of just, you know, kind of picking up the phone and saying, hey, how are you? Right? You know, you really want to have some clear communication, some clear boundaries, and consistency around that. Because that helps everyone, right? With those expectations.
Mm-hmm. And then if perhaps those expectations aren't being met, you know, someone shutting down, or it's like, hey, okay, you know, there's projects. I mean, again, I think there's huge levels of grace and empathy and all the things, but again, from a practical standpoint, um, just thinking about like, as long is it smart perhaps that the other person is engaging and involved and communicative and meeting deadlines, that then perhaps hopefully you can add a little bit more grace. But if the other person's kind of shutting down, or not meeting the expectations, or you know, or honoring the boundaries that you've set professionally.
Sure. And I think, you know, again, there could be, if the person's shutting down, or if the person is not respecting boundaries in the sense of maybe wanting to communicate too much, right? You know, maybe that could be an issue that comes up as well. So again, that just requires some direct empathic communication, right? So again, really revisiting that by saying, you know, Kate, I noticed that you're not kind of available for our meeting times that we set up. I want to make sure that you're doing okay. Can we set up another time to talk? And really be very clear with, okay, I can see that this might not be working for you. We need to have a conversation about, you know, what we need to shift or what needs to happen. So that can be done in a very compassionate way, but it also needs to be direct if it's kind of going down that path. And quite possibly someone needs support that you can't provide them, you know, and is that a conversation that needs to happen? Maybe they do need some extra time. And at that point, that can be discussed as far as some other resources.
Yeah. Gosh, it's just so hard, you know, just thinking about, as you said, we're all humans and we're multifaceted, and, you know, we show up to work, you know, we show up, we're we show up to work, we're at home, we're parents, we're daughters, we're sisters, we're partners, we're business partners, we're employees and teammates. We all wear so many hats.
Yeah.
And it's just impossible to think that, or it's just, for me, it's interesting to think about how much who I am at home or what's happening at home influences who I am at work and vice versa. And so I'm just thinking about all the different crises that I've seen friends and family and rise members and colleagues, everyone navigate. And it's true, as you see, there's no one size fits all. We're all unique human beings. And I think we're all growing through these difficult experiences too. I think that's also the place that my mind goes as we're having this conversation is each of these difficult crisis situations, as difficult as they are, whether you're the one experiencing it, going through the crisis, or you're the one guiding someone through it, we're growing through these situations. We're learning about ourselves, we're learning about others, we're learning grace and empathy and leadership skills and communication skills. So as much as in so many ways, I never want to have to navigate a crisis, it's those crises that really shape the strongest leaders and the strongest women. So I think that's something, at least that's where my mind goes through all of this. And I'm grateful for your perspectives around this too. My mind is spinning around all of it in a good way. Yeah.
Oh, well, good. Well, thanks, Kate. I mean, I think, what you're talking about too is there's a term called post-traumatic growth. I don't know if you've heard that before,
Oh, ooh,
but, we
yes.
talk about post-traumatic stress all the time, but there's also, flip side of that, which is post-traumatic growth. So again, speaks to exactly what you're talking about, which are, yes, crises are horrible to go through. We wish we didn't have to. And unfortunately, it's part of the human experience. And there's so much learning and growth that comes through crises. So, and that's why talking about this from a workplace and leadership perspective is so important, because being able to support through a crisis is how people grow through it, and how people can come to that place of post-traumatic growth rather than stress. So there is, really a lot to be said about learning these skills and having these conversations. And I also like to think of them as just life skills, right? Because again, it's not only in the workplace, it's everywhere, every aspect of our life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. When friends turn to us for support and family members, children, knowing how to show up in the best way that we can, and also knowing that we're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
We're not going to do it perfectly, and we can learn from it as we go along. I think that's the exciting journey that we're all on called life for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what I always say is this, this kind of work is simple, but it's not easy, meaning that it takes practice. It takes practice to really sit with someone with empathy and compassion. It takes practice to really learn how to communicate well with people and when things are difficult. So, it's the more you practice, the better and the easier it becomes.
I love that. It's simple, but it's not easy.
Mhm.
That applies to many things. Oh, I love it. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you think is important for people to hear or to know, or any kind of final thoughts that you want to make sure that really resonate for folks?
Well, thanks, Kate. Thanks again for having me here for this conversation. It's been great. I think for me, I often get asked, things about what should I say? What should I do? And again, just reiterating that piece of there is no one size fits all. There's not kind of one thing you should say. There are certainly elements that you kind of don't want to do, right? I mean, you really want to make sure that you're not making assumptions, as we talked before. You're not forcing people to tell you their story. You're not forcing people to, go past their boundaries, those types of things. But also, really the communication piece is so important. And making sure you're acknowledging someone's experience
Mhm.
and that you are listening
Mhm.
and that you are slowing down are all really important parts that we can easily miss not intentionally, but it can be missed. So, being intentional, having awareness, and again, showing up and doing your best.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that because it brings up a question for me. So often I feel like my knee-jerk reaction is to hear that something has happened to someone and say, I'm so sorry. But I
Mhm.
feel like I've heard conflicting things about being sorry and saying you're sorry for something has happened. And I think especially coming with that empathy. Are there certain terms that come with empathetic listening or I don't know, or terms, ways, I don't know, either as I know you just said, there's no one size fits all term, but I would
Yep.
like you to give me one, please. No. But
Like,
are
go
there,
on a list. Like,
but
okay,
I
say
think,
this, and this.
yes, but I like that what not to say. Well, there's not one size what to say. What types of things should we avoid saying? Whether it's that, what is it? Toxic empathy, everything's going to be okay.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's not,
Right.
or, oh, he's in a better place. It's like, well, you don't know that person's belief systems,
Right.
like, are there things like that you can think of just from like a super basic kind of level of things to avoid saying?
For sure. You've definitely said a couple of them, right? I mean, and another thing that we say, there are a couple things that we say really consistently that can be unhelpful, which are, oh, I know how you feel.
Yeah.
Do we ever really know how someone feels, right? That can really be minimizing and can also turn it back towards you, right? Which is, if you're there to support someone else, you want it to be about them. So, I'd avoid saying, I know how you feel. Another one that we talk about a lot is saying, I understand, which again, we say all the time with good intention. However, again, if someone's in crisis, that may feel like, how could you possibly understand?
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
So, so any kind of sentiment like that, things that you can say that can be helpful are, again, to kind of stay in that reflective listening, or something that sounds, oh, that sounds really hard. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Or, just really staying in that place of that listening of, oh, I want to be here and hear what you're saying to me.
Mhm.
Um, or, sometimes people say, oh, I hear you, right?
Mhm.
Something that simple.
I like that.
Um, and certainly if somebody is really talking a lot, you can say, oh, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Tell me
So
more.
they're just those questions that let someone know that you care and that you're hearing them.
I love that too. Like it's so we have this human instinct to talk about ourselves,
Mhm.
um, but it's not, especially in a time of crisis. It's not about you, other than how you can support them or how you can be there, or the organization can be there for them, or at least that's not the time. I like that. So being that reminder of say more, I hear you, not I understand. I
Yeah, right. And again, it's hard. It really, you have to be mindful doing it. Again, it takes practice. But and a lot too we can do between with eye contact and body language, right? So, here we are on Zoom, but we are able to engage in that way. So certainly if you're with someone in person, even just listening and doing the nonverbals, really, really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, even thinking too about physical touch, that's a
Mhm.
non-issue right now. But yeah, in a workplace too. I mean, I've always been a hugger, but not everyone is. So once we get back to that physical touch place as well, I know, especially depending on the organization, it can kind of be blurrier lines. But again, too, is that a case where you just kind of let the other person either ask what they need or let them and kind of follow their lead on if they're asking for a hug, asking for physical touch?
Yeah, so this is one that comes up in so many of the trainings I do around crisis, because kind of the rule of thumb around touch is, yeah, it's always, you're never to touch someone without permission, right? Even just like putting your hand on their leg or, their shoulder, whatever, if you're sitting with them. Some people will automatically want to grab your hand or hug you, even if they don't know you, right? It really depends on the person. Um, and so, yes, you never want to touch without permission. And also, you have to be aware of your own comfort level with touch.
Sure.
Because if someone does touch you and you kind of recoil, that's not going to feel good. So,
Right. Right.
just things to be aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, it's a complicated issue, but as you said, it's simple but not easy. So no, this was a meaningful and thought-provoking conversation for me for sure. And I definitely feel definitely better prepared and a good, to be mindful and present and things to consider the next time that I have to navigate a crisis, whether myself, hopefully it's not for a long time. And as you said, it's one of those things that we don't wish upon happening, although hopefully there's that post-traumatic growth after each opportunity. So, Lori, thank you so much for the time and for sharing your invaluable perspectives and resources. And both being on Rise Digital, I'm going to put all of your information. I'm sure you would welcome people reaching out to you to connect questions, talk about opportunities and needs they may have.
Absolutely. And if, any resource questions, I'm happy to be a resource for people. So yeah, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. And what other, just the opportunity, other types of topics and in addition to navigating crisis that you kind of touch on and support with individuals and organizations?
Yeah, so I do emotional wellness in the workplace. So that can range from handling difficult conversations, all the way through to supporting someone through a crisis. So, the trainings range from an hour to all day workshops, depending on what the needs are. Um, you know, Currently I've been doing a lot around stress management and self-care as well, creating some healthy habits. And that's also work I do with individuals too.
That's great. Oh, good. Well, this was a pleasure to be with you, Lori. Thank you so much. And I appreciate everyone who tuned in to watch us. And I hope that everyone feels as prepared to navigate difficult conversations the next time they come our way. Thank you,
Thanks,
Lori.
Kate.
Take care.